Doctors gave up on his son, but the maid's secret saved his life. The words cut through the silence like glass. Your son won't make it past 2 months. Machines beeped in rhythm with despair, and for the first time, billionaire Jonathan Reed couldn't buy a way out. But in that mansion, someone unexpected refused to believe the ending had already been written. Jonathan Reed had sat through boardroom wars and billion-dollar negotiations, but nothing compared to this. 5 specialists stood at the end of his son's hospital bed, their words clipped and clinical. No surgical option, no effective treatment left. Best you can do is make him comfortable. Jonathan's 8-year-old son Noah lay propped on pillows. His chest rattled with each breath, small hands trembling as he tried to hold a cup of water. Jonathan reached out quickly, steadying it, but the helplessness stung. For years, Jonathan had built skyscrapers, crushed competitors, and been called ruthless. Yet here, under fluorescent lights, he was just a father facing the collapse of his entire world. He nodded at the doctors, asked polite questions, and signed the release papers for home care. But that night, back in the silent mansion, he watched cartoons flicker across the TV as Noah's shallow breaths filled the room. Jonathan tucked the blankets tighter and whispered, "I'm here, buddy." The empire outside those walls meant nothing. Inside, his son's life was slipping like sand through his fingers. The mansion felt cavernous, every chandelier and marble pillar mocking Jonathan's wealth. He had filled it with staff, chefs, nurses, housekeepers, but the silence inside was crushing. That night, he sat in his study, grief pressing like a stone against his chest, when a soft knock came at the door. It was Clara Morales, one of the maids. She had been with the household only a few months, quiet, almost invisible. Her dark eyes carried a gentleness that unsettled him. "Sir," she said softly. "Noah asked for water, but he wouldn't take it from me. He looked scared." Jonathan rubbed his face. "He doesn't connect with strangers." Clara hesitated, then added, "Maybe not strangers, but he doesn't see me as one." He frowned, studying her. She had walked into this house with nothing but cleaning rags, yet somehow his son trusted her. Clara lowered her voice. "When I sat with him earlier, he reminded me of my little brother. He was sick too." Jonathan felt something crack inside him. For a moment, the billionaire mask slipped, and what remained was only a father desperate for any thread of hope. The next morning, Clara entered Noah's room not as a maid, but simply as someone willing to sit. Noah was on the floor, blocks scattered around him. He didn't look up. Clara didn't speak. She sat cross-legged near him, silent and patient. Minutes stretched until finally Noah nudged a blue block toward her with his foot. Clara smiled softly, sliding a red one back. It wasn't much, but it was connection. From the hallway, Jonathan watched, stunned. For months, Noah had withdrawn from everyone, even trained therapists. Yet here he was, nudging blocks toward a maid as though inviting her into his fragile world. Later that night, Jonathan found Clara in the kitchen. His voice was careful, almost pleading. "Why him? Why would he trust you?" Clara lowered her gaze. "Because I don't ask him for anything. I just see him." Her words landed heavier than any lecture from specialists. Jonathan realized something he hadn't dared admit. His son didn't need more machines or professionals right now. He needed presence. And somehow Clara had brought it. For the first time, Jonathan felt a flicker of something beyond despair. Hope. Days began to shift in subtle ways. Noah, once locked in silence, started making small gestures. At breakfast, he tapped his spoon twice until Clara looked up, then slid his plate toward her. She smiled and placed strawberries on it. He ate without protest. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, stunned. That small exchange felt larger than any stock victory. His son was reaching out. But not everyone in the house shared his awe. Margaret Sloan, the head nurse, frowned each time Clara entered Noah's room. "She's not licensed," she muttered to the staff. "This is irresponsible." Clara ignored the whispers. She didn't care about their approval, only Noah's trust. One afternoon, Jonathan paused at his study window. Outside in the garden, Clara crouched beside Noah as he arranged pebbles into shapes. She mirrored his actions, letting him lead. Jonathan watched his son's shoulders loosen. His small eyes flickered toward Clara's with fleeting trust. It pierced him deeper than any business deal. He realized he was witnessing something money had never been able to buy. Trust. But with hope came resistance. Margaret confronted Clara one evening near the staff wing. "You're overstepping," she snapped. "One good day doesn't make you his savior. When Mr. Reed realizes you're a liability, you'll be gone." Clara met her gaze steadily. "If I wanted to keep my job, I'd stay out of his way. But I'm not here for me." The words carried no anger, only conviction. Margaret scoffed, storming off, but Jonathan, who had overheard, stood frozen in the hall. He had built an empire by cutting out weakness. Yet here was this woman untrained and unpolished, showing a strength he hadn't seen in anyone else. That night, Jonathan found Clara sitting beside Noah's bed. His small hand curled around her sleeve as he drifted into sleep. She had slumped in exhaustion but hadn't left his side. Jonathan whispered to himself, "How do you do it?" The answer, he realized, wasn't in strategy or wealth. It was in presence, something he had forgotten how to give. For the first time, the walls of his mansion felt less like a prison and more like a home in the making. Morning sunlight spilled through high windows, yet Jonathan sat restless at the dining table. From down the hall he could hear Noah's faint laughter, a sound so rare it almost felt foreign. Clara was with him in the conservatory, lining up toy trains. Jonathan's mother, Victoria Reed, arrived unannounced that afternoon. Sharp, silver-haired, she had raised Jonathan on discipline and appearances. When she saw Clara crouched beside Noah holding a picture book, her lips pressed into a thin line. "That girl doesn't belong here," she muttered. But in that same moment, Noah tugged Clara's sleeve and whispered, "Again." Victoria froze. For years the boy had resisted speech, yet here he was asking. Later, Jonathan confronted Clara by the firelight in his study. "What did you do?" "He spoke to you." Clara shook her head. "I didn't do anything magical. I just waited. Sometimes children don't need fixing. They need safety, and when they feel it, they find their voice." Jonathan stared at the flames, the truth heavier than gold. Clara hadn't healed his son. She had given him permission to heal. Rumors churned through the household. Some staff whispered that Clara was manipulating Noah to secure her place. Margaret fanned the doubts, warning Jonathan that emotional tricks would not save his son. But Jonathan couldn't deny what he saw with his own eyes. Noah was changing, slowly but unmistakably. One night, as Jonathan lingered by Noah's door, he saw Clara seated by the bed, reading softly. Noah's hand clung to hers, his chest rising with steadier breaths. The sight carved into Jonathan's heart. For months he had carried grief like a stone, convinced nothing could save his boy. But here was a flicker of life he hadn't dared imagine. Later, Jonathan asked Clara, "Why stay?" "My staff resents you. The world won't reward you. Why keep doing this?" Clara's gaze didn't waver. "Because when Noah pushed that block toward me, he told me he wanted someone to stay." "That's enough." Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. For years he had relied on power to fix things. But now he was learning that sometimes healing came not from control but from surrender. The storm broke in the great hall. Victoria summoned a family meeting, her cane tapping sharply against the polished floor. Staff lined the walls, whispers buzzing. Jonathan sat at the head of the oak table, Clara near the doorway, uncertain if she belonged. Victoria's voice cut the air. "This house has been built on appearances, but appearances don't raise a child, people do. And right now the only person Noah trusts is the one you all whisper about." Gasps rippled as her cane pointed toward Clara. Margaret snapped, "She's unqualified, a maid, nothing more. You're putting the boy at risk." Before Clara could reply, Victoria's voice sharpened. "Risk? The real risk was letting arrogance blind us while a child went unheard. She saw what none of you did because she chose to listen." Jonathan rose slowly, his voice steadier than anyone expected. "I once believed wealth could fix everything. But I've watched my son fade under experts' care, and I've watched him come alive again with her." His eyes found Clara. "From this day forward, she stays not as staff but as Noah's caregiver." The hall fell silent. Clara's breath trembled. Hope had found its voice. The days that followed carried a different rhythm. The mansion, once heavy with grief, began to hum with quieter sounds. Small footsteps, the click of toy trains, a child's soft laugh echoing faintly through grand halls. Noah had not been cured, not in any medical sense, but something had shifted. He was present. He tugged at Clara's sleeve when he wanted her attention, or pointed toward the garden when he longed for sunlight. One morning, Jonathan lingered near the conservatory, watching as Noah pressed a block into Clara's hand and whispered, "Blue." The word was fragile, almost breaking, but it pierced Jonathan's heart. Tears blurred his vision. This was more than progress. It was a miracle in motion. That evening, when Clara came to check on Noah, she found Jonathan waiting by the door. His voice was raw. For months I prayed for a sign. Today I heard it in one word. Thank you. Clara shook her head gently. Don't thank me. Thank him for choosing to try. Jonathan nodded, knowing deep down that both were true. But illness is cruel, and miracles rarely come without trials. One night, the alarms from Noah's oxygen monitor shrieked through the mansion. Jonathan rushed in, his heart pounding as he saw his son gasping, his chest heaving desperately for air. Margaret pushed past him, barking orders. We need to call emergency services now. She fumbled with equipment, her hands shaking. Clara, calmer than anyone else in the chaos, leaned over Noah, speaking softly in Spanish, words of comfort her brother once clung to when sickness stole his breath. Noah's panicked eyes found hers, and somehow he slowed, following her rhythm as she guided him to breathe through the mask. Jonathan watched, stunned. The monitor steadied. His son clutched Clara's hand until the tremors stopped. When the paramedics arrived, they found him stable, no longer in immediate danger. Margaret bristled, muttering, she took an enormous risk. But Jonathan saw the truth in Noah's grip. His son hadn't trusted the machines or the nurse or even his father in that moment. He had trusted Clara, and she hadn't failed him. The near loss rattled everyone. Jonathan spent the night by Noah's bed, his suit rumpled, his hand resting on his boy's blanket. At dawn, Clara entered quietly with tea, her eyes tired but steady. Jonathan looked up, words choking. You saved him? Clara shook her head. No, he saved himself. I only reminded him how. Jonathan's throat tightened. For years, he had equated saving with power, control, wealth. Yet here was a woman who had saved his son with patience, love, and presence, things money could never buy. Later that day, Victoria approached Clara in the hallway. Her sharpness softened as she said, You remind me of someone I once knew. She was stubborn, too. She believed love could outlast pain. She was my daughter-in-law, Jonathan's wife. Clara froze, realizing Victoria was speaking of the woman Noah barely remembered. Victoria's voice trembled. I see her in you, and I thank you for giving a piece of her back to this house. For the first time, Clara felt the walls of judgment lift. In their place, she found belonging. As weeks stretched into months, Noah's world widened. He still faced his illness, but now he faced it with courage. In the garden, he stacked stones with Clara, smiling faintly when they toppled. At night, he whispered short words. Again. Blue. Stay. Each one was a victory that left Jonathan in awe. The mansion, once filled with cold echoes, now held warmth. Staff who once doubted Clara began to soften, quietly watching the boy's transformation. Even Margaret, though still stiff, no longer argued openly. One evening, Jonathan stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights. Clara joined him, arms crossed against the breeze. You've done more for him than the world's best doctors, Jonathan said quietly. Clara shook her head. Doctors heal bodies. Sometimes children need someone to heal their hope. Jonathan looked at her, seeing not a maid but the anchor his son had desperately needed. His voice cracked. You've given him back to me. In that silence, under a sky dusted with stars, he realized something else. Clara hadn't only saved Noah, she had saved him too. But healing is never linear. Some nights were still filled with coughing fits, alarms, and fear. Yet even in those moments, there was a difference now. Noah didn't face them alone. Clara would sit by his bed, whispering lullabies her grandmother once sang. Jonathan would hold his son's hand, no longer retreating into silence. One night, as rain lashed the windows, Noah stirred awake and whispered hoarsely, Dad? Jonathan froze. It had been so long since he had heard that word. His eyes brimmed as he bent close. Yes, buddy. I'm right here. Noah's small hand reached for him, resting weakly against his chest. Clara watched quietly, tears glistening. For years, Jonathan had lived like a fortress, his heart guarded after losing his wife. But in that fragile moment, his son tore down the walls with a single word, and Jonathan realized, sometimes love returns not as a flood, but as a whisper in the dark. Spring arrived, and with it, change. Noah was still sick, but he was no longer only a patient. He was a boy rediscovering pieces of childhood. One morning he tugged Clara's sleeve and pointed toward the garden. Together they planted seeds in a small patch of soil. Jonathan joined them, kneeling awkwardly in his tailored trousers, dirt on his hands for the first time in years. When the first shoots sprouted weeks later, Noah's smile lit the air brighter than the chandeliers ever had. At dinner that evening, Victoria raised her glass. To family, the kind we're born with and the kind we find. Jonathan's throat tightened. He looked at Clara, seated beside Noah, and realized she was no longer just staff. She was family. The boy who had once been slipping away was alive with laughter, fragile but fighting. And the man who had once measured life in deals and towers now measured it in moments. Blocks pushed across a floor. Strawberries at breakfast whispered words in the night. Hope had rebuilt their home, brick by invisible brick. On a quiet evening, Jonathan stood in the doorway of Noah's room. The boy was asleep, one hand curled around Clara's. She sat beside him, head bowed in exhaustion but still present. Jonathan's eyes blurred with tears. He thought back to the words that once crushed him, 2 months. Yet here they were, far beyond that deadline, living not in fear but in fragile, beautiful hope. He whispered into the stillness. Thank you, Clara, for giving him back his life, for giving me back my heart. Clara stirred, lifting her eyes, and simply nodded. No words were needed. Jonathan turned, stepping softly into the hall. For the first time in years, the mansion didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. Because salvation hadn't come from doctors or wealth. It had come from someone no one expected, someone who had refused to accept an ending written too soon. And as Noah slept peacefully, the house seemed to breathe with him. It was not the end. It was the beginning. If this story touched your heart, don't let it fade. Subscribe, like, and press the bell icon so you never miss these journeys of hope. Because somewhere someone needs to hear they're not alone. And sometimes the person who changes everything is the one you least expect.